Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about consolidating stress as a concept and then also how we apply that to in-season training. Okay, so stress is kind of like the most important thing we want to manage and kind of get from training, right? We need a large enough stress, a potent enough stimulus to kind of knock the body out of kind of its normal homeostasis and force it to adapt, okay? And so if we think about this in terms of trying to develop throwing velocity, sprinting speed, power, we need to be at 95% or better of our maximal output capabilities, right? In order to kind of drive this effect and to have it be a stimulating enough session to kind of force ourselves to adapt, okay? And so what's gonna kind of happen is that if we are not kind of fresh, recovered enough, all of these things to truly kind of reach these maximal outputs on a given training day, then that session is not going to be stimulating enough to be worth our time, okay? So this is kind of why it's important to kind of have this, the high-low model that we've talked about before, right? High days need to stay high, low days need to stay low so that we're recovered enough for these high days. So in terms of consolidating stress, what does that look like? Well, it means that we want our kind of high CNS kind of qualities to be on the same day, right? So for example, this might be throwing hard and lifting heavy. It might be throwing hard and sprinting, right? We want these high CNS qualities to be on one day, right? So think throwing hard, lifting heavy, sprinting, throwing stuff, jumping, all of these kinds of qualities will go on a high day. And then on the low day, think of things like extensive plyometrics, kind of tempo runs, any of your kind of aerobic conditioning modalities, right? Mobility circuits, could be the accessories kind of like at the end of your training sessions. Those kinds of things could all fit well on a low day. Recovery throwing, where we keep it 75% or below. The big thing to think about when we're talking about consolidating stress is we want to stay out of that middle range, right? If we get in this middle range, what kind of happens is it's high enough that it's going to impact recovery in a negative way, and it's too low to drive a meaningful effect for kind of these power and speed gains that we're looking for, okay? So we want to make sure we're keeping it high or low for the most part. All right, so if low days become too intense, we have problems on our high days. We can't reach these 95+% intensities that we need to get to, okay? One of the things that we want to think about when it comes to in-season training is residual effects of training. All right, so if we think about like the various qualities we might train. So for example, strength and hypertrophy, we know that if we don't train them, they'll probably hang around for about a month, okay? But once those qualities start to diminish, we're gonna have a real impact on both our performance and our health potentially, okay? And then speed, right, these highly neurological qualities, they're gonna hang around even less time. We're thinking 2 to 8 days, somewhere in that range. So these need to be touched pretty frequently. I think the important thing to recognize with all of these qualities is that the volume, the frequency, the density, all of these things that we're touching these qualities with in season are going to be different than in the off season, okay? So what does this look like? Well, it's going to depend on the athlete, it's going to depend on their role on the team, it's going to depend on their training age, all of these kinds of things, right? So athletes who are closer to their genetic ceiling, right, can create more stress and output and all of these things in a given training session that's going to then take them longer to recover from. Whereas novice athletes, you know, super low training age, all these kinds of things, their training one isn't going to be stressful enough, / they probably can't make it stressful enough to have these kind of really big stressors they then need to recover from where it's going to negatively impact their performance. So the higher ceiling guys who've been training for a long time, their training is going to have to change a decent amount in season. And so what that's going to kind of look like, frequency is going to come down, volume is going to come down, intensity may come down a little bit, but that's going to be the one we adjust the least. All right, so when we're thinking about volume for the more advanced guys, generally 10 to 40% less in a given session is kind of the range we're going to be in, depending on what their kind of session volume has looked like throughout the off season and throughout their careers, okay? With novice athletes, we may not need to change volume a whole lot, right? If a kid's only coming in, for example, kind of twice a week throughout the off season, right? They're brand new to training. Are we really going to change much? Are we going to knock any sets off of what they're doing? No, they're probably not strong enough for it to really make a difference, right? They can get stronger at around 60% of their 1 rep max. That changes as you kind of get older, get more mature, all those kinds of things. We have to touch closer to 85% to kind of actually make these strength improvements, okay? So that's going to be something that has to change. On the intensity side, For the advanced guys, we're generally dropping it somewhere between 5 and 15%. So it doesn't need to be a whole lot. Again, it'll depend on what it looks like throughout the offseason, throughout their careers, what we actually do in terms of adjustments. And then in terms of that frequency, this again is going to depend on the role and then how you kind of model it in season in terms of whether it's like a true microdosing approach or if it's going to be kind of your more standard in-season approach. Generally, for most of our guys, if they're a starter, we're looking for 2 or 3 kind of training sessions throughout the week. If they're, for example, a college starter who's throwing every Friday, this is pretty easy to schedule and it makes it very simple kind of from their end and our end. If they're a reliever, this is going to be a little bit more challenging. If they have a well-defined role, it's going to be a little bit easier. If they don't have as well-defined a role, they're kind of fighting for innings, all these things have to be ready all the time, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. So for starters, typically we can have this laid out in a given week, what it looks like. For a reliever, it's going to be more if-then type of stuff. So let's talk about starters first. So in season for a starter, generally day 0, they're going to pitch. Game day +1, so the next day is going to be kind of a more intense lower body session. The day after that, game day +2, is going to be a more intense upper body session, right? And then generally game day -3, somewhere around there will be their bullpen day. This is going to be where we do a full body, relatively lower volume, higher velocity type of session on that day. And then within that, there is some freedom for like a light kind of aerobic conditioning day or mobility circuit day. And there's an option for a game day -1 kind of primer or potentiating session if that's something they like and want, okay? So how do we stack stressors in the season is kind of a really important thing. And what you can kind of see is we want to keep these bigger stressors closer to the day you're pitching in the game, and then closer to the day you're kind of throwing your bullpen, because those are going to be your big stressors from the sport specific side throughout that week. So we want to keep our kind of general stressors close to that as well, so we kind of optimize our recovery time outside of that. Now, if you're a reliever, this can be a little bit more challenging, okay? If you're the closer, for example, you know that for the most part, maybe you throw in that midweek, and then maybe you throw once or twice on the weekend, but you're probably not doing much more than that, right? And depending on who you're playing in that midweek, you may be able to kind of cross that off. If it's an out-of-conference opponent who you guys are going to absolutely slaughter, you're probably not getting any innings that game. So it can be easier to plan around that way. But as a reliever, you may need to, in some cases, lift the night kind of right after a game in order to make that happen, or lift the next day, but these guys will generally have an even lower volume approach than the starters will for the most part, especially if they don't know when they're pitching. And then kind of even going on from there, we can get to like more of a true microdosing approach where they could lift, the day of a game where they might pitch that evening, and the volume's going to be low enough that they're still going to feel totally fresh to kind of get out there and do that. So these are kind of the things you want to think about. But I think the really important things to kind of consider are that we don't want to have these long stretches. Bare minimum, the high school season, we're talking about 2.5 months. Right, even in the Mid-Atlantic, kind of northeast here, the high school season is going to be that length of time. So we talked about the residual effects in the beginning. You're not maintaining your strength and hypertrophy for that whole time if you don't do anything, and you're certainly not maintaining your speed qualities. And so if we see guys who don't train and then come back in 3 to 6 months later, we're going to see significant deficits when we go to retest them again from that kind of high force side of things, and generally the speed side of things as well, because they're just not touching that practice or game days other than specifically throwing. So these are just kind of some things to think about how you want to lay out your week, making sure that we're actually touching these qualities as we go. All right, and making sure that the season is still a period of development in a lot of cases, and not a period where we're just kind of hanging on for dear life and trying not to move backwards. Thanks for watching. If you got any questions, feel free to drop them below. We'll see you in the next one.